set up. Just so you know, we've got one slide, excellent, so none of this PowerPoint nonsense from me. There it is, possibly the greatest slide you've ever seen, so there we are. So here we are, so in the home of brutally simple thinking, I have to say brands are built on trust, end of. To take you through this, basically, where I came from on the first book, I remember speaking about it 2 years ago when I just finished it. The book I started while Trump was campaigning, and I looked at what was sort of going on a contextual basis in society, how that was impacting from a political level on society and culture, and how it was impacting on brands. And at that point, there were a ton of articles being written in the marketing press and the sort of strategy sort of management press generally, in the national press, a lot of it no doubt by people like yourselves. But what I noticed was that no one had written a book connecting all those areas that we were speaking about then from the point of view of trust and transparency and privacy and empathy and ethics, along with things like the growth of surveillance capitalism, deep fakes, alternative facts, etc. So basically, I bolted together what were, from my point of view, the world's most obvious issues. Basically, it took every agency's annual deck and smashed it into a book. When I was writing, obviously, I was just paranoid that there were, you go to any bookshop, as I've just now Waterston signing copies of the new one, but you go to any bookshop over the last couple of years, you couldn't move for the amount of books on disruption, so one of those. But when I was over in the States, I remember seeing a precursor of a Time magazine headline, "Is Truth Dead?" which obviously mimicked the old 60s headline, "Is God Dead?" The Lennon quote, which sort of outraged the American public. I remember checking it out online, obviously on Amazon, going to the local sort of bookstores and saying, right, what have you got on trust from a branding perspective? Nothing. And so I wrote the book thinking, obviously at any point something's going to drop into market or going to be tons of books dropping in. Nothing did. So I can say, it sounds a ridiculous statement, hand on heart, that was the first book anywhere in the world that connected all the most obvious issues there are. I only wrote it, I think, from the point of view everyone thought someone else had already done it. So thank God it was me. Anyway, so the key thing that I was really talking about were, things like, brands are built on trust. It goes to the heart of every relationship we have, whether it be in our personal relationships, our relationships with political parties, or FMCG brands, and everything in between. I linked it into what I termed reputation capital, from the point of view brands being viewed through a prism of, are they trustworthy, reliable, and competent? And you can put trustworthy, reliable, and competent against a Corbyn, or against a Johnson, or against a Trump, or against someone like Elizabeth Warren, or whatever. And just view it through that prism of actually how are people viewing this, whether it be, in terms of what is the real impact of trust today. Well, if you're Boeing, you've got a real problem on your hands. If you're looking at the Chinese national brand, you've got a real problem on your hands. If you're VW, you've got a real problem in your hands. And the last few years, if you're a fashion brand having stuff made in third world sweatshops, you've got a problem on your hands. I remember talking about this way back in the late 90s when I was going on a lot of the anarchist demonstrations, the Reclaim the Streets demos and Carnival Against Capitalism. I remember interviewed Naomi Klein while she's writing No Logo, and for the elder planners here, you remember how No Logo, the great Marxist treatise against branding, had a seismic impact on Brandland. And I interviewed her. She's kind enough to give me quotes for a piece I was writing back in the 90s, late 98 for the Face magazine, the late great Face, or obviously to be reborn, on just what that meant for brands, and she really got from that Marxist perspective what brands were all about. So basically through the book I was just looking at what this means for society and how Brandland really understands this or not. And so naturally you can look at everything from the output from the World Economic Forum, where there are endless talks about how digitization and fake news and alternative facts undermine democracy. A lot of talk obviously about democracy has to happen in the open. Democracy dies in darkness, to use a great sort of media line. And over obviously the last few years, I realised doing a lot of talks as we all do. I was in the Middle East with on a platform with David Plouffe, who's Obama's campaign chief, and I was talking to him about what was going on. And the talk he gave at that point, 4 years ago, was brilliant and talked about all the data scraping they did through Facebook and how it worked for them because it helped them to hyper-target everyone on a psychographic basis, and we're going, yeah, isn't that fantastic, very liberal audience, and then and I was saying, so what's going to happen, because at that point the Trump campaign was going on, he's going, oh, Trump will win without a doubt because he's doing what we did and just taking it to the next degree at a massive level, which is exactly obviously what they did. So I talked there again about just the history of that initial campaign and how what Obama had done and the tactics he'd used had obviously then just been basically taken on and really pushed to the next level. And obviously since then, this year we're going to see that activity happening to an even greater level. And with things like deep fake technology, will enable, as we all know, politicians to appear to be giving speeches they never gave in places they've never been to, whether that be Stoke or whatever, or Taunton. So a bit of that. From the point of view of where does that go to the sort of heart of culture, and you always talk about, I talk a lot in the book about, the issues of trust going to the heart of philosophy. Plato thought obviously it was what philosophy was all about. You can look at it through the prism of the angle of where did trust go in terms of the way that it was looked at by the intellectuals, by the philosophers. So obviously then saw people like obviously Nietzsche looked at it as something that was that trust and truth were subjective. You had the whole postmodern movement, obviously, when you had the Derridas and the Foucaults of the world, seeing trust and truth in particular as being something to be attacked. And you had sort of Wittgenstein, obviously, before that, looking at it had to be empirical, it had to be observational, it had to be experienced, and that's how you built your version of what was going on. In the next book, I look a lot there again about DC again about authenticity. Steve's hated issue about authenticity. That again, I remember day one in Adland, and everyone used to bang on about it, and no one could ever quite pin a note on what authenticity was all about. So I just explained it through the prism of brand activity and philosophical thought. So you could look at, put it in the current context. Patagonia, the brand that everyone has to have in every presentation, and rightly so, obviously, because they are so wonderful. You can look at, okay, so you could explain perhaps the closing the stores so everyone could go and vote, or to encourage people not to shop and to vote instead, as being a typical sort of Aristotle type viewpoint from the point of view of a virtuous act that was done for its own reasons and not to engender a public vote. You could look at something like the fantastic Nike kind of CaperNet campaign, and obviously the point there was it had to be an ongoing movement and not just an ad. And so from the point of view of something that was done, no doubt, that they were no doubt shouted down a lot internally about, are you insane doing this, it's going to get us so much abuse, there's going to be so much sort of anti-Nike feeling, how dare we do this, which there was, but obviously the majority was the other way. You could say that linked with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the great political philosopher, whose view on authenticity, just as Aristotle looked at it, obviously from the point of view of the virtuous man does a virtuous thing for their own reason. Rousseau obviously talked about passion. Talked about doing things because he felt it was the right thing to do, not doing it because you could rationalise it, in the same way as all creatives hate quant ad testing because it's all rationalised. You can look at at brands like Tom's in terms of their one-for-one business model being done, which obviously is mimicked now endlessly elsewhere, and you could look at that completely from a sort of a Nietzschean perspective. Talk about a lot in the book, again, for the point of view of the brand viewing itself as art, as something to be endlessly regenerated, linking with the inner genius and doing the right thing for the right reasons, and that being an ongoing thing. Authenticity is something that is a work in progress, not something you're born with. So again, I think it's very interesting how a lot of people appear not to really get how authenticity can be looked at in different ways through different prisms, and it can mean different things to different people. There's not just one definition of it. So a bit of that. So I think the real sort of key point that looked at through the book was again how, certainly the first book, was how all those issues that we link either with the political party of choice, where those old sayings of Labour, no matter which side of the political prism you come from, in the UK, Labour, when they started from a notion of decency and warmth and caring and compassion. That was the point of Labour when they started. And if the Tories could have been viewed in the past as being the efficient, quite cruel people who just, the adults were in the room, and then what went wrong, we've just heard what went wrong. I think it's really interesting, again, how notions of truth and trust and transparency and empathy and ethics really play around there. So to quickly finish off, the real sort of angle of where the book then went was really just to say that, again, those issues of, when we all know that virtually there's a minuscule difference between most brands in most sectors. What they therefore rely on are people like yourselves to essentially lie, to exaggerate wildly, to try and have something that pushes the brand forward in a completely sort of almost utopian way. Meanwhile, advertising itself, the ultimate capitalist driver, which really was built essentially on promoting issues of self-doubt and self sort of and a yearning for something else, is now itself that great capitalist driver moving into a world where it's pushing what one considered to be very socialist values. If advertising is now moving to a lot into the world of community and collaboration and decency and acting for the public good, and brands should be there to be respected because they're stepping into a space that's emptied out, you can say that's a socialist framing, as opposed to basically the way that advertising was, which was really promoting self-doubt. It's now really doing a very different thing, which interestingly doesn't really link with the current UK national voting ethos. Discuss. That's it. Thank you.